Okay. Good morning. It's the 7th of December, 2021. This is Mass Media and Mass Culture, Mass Media and Culture, whatever it's called. Course number 302082. And today I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. Injustice, the film, and social mapping. And they are related, but we'll look in detail at labor and work. As a part of mass culture, right, it seems like a justifiable and interesting topic to discuss. So I'll talk about that for about an hour, and then we'll kick off a discussion of the responses. Now, I wonder if people recognize this happy couple. The woman is Stella Morris, and the man is Julian Assange. And they got married recently, and that could be why they're so happy in this obvious publicity photo. But they got married in prison, and Julian Assange has been in Belmarsh High Security prison for a bit over 2 years now. Because he broke the conditions of his bail in 2012 by taking refuge in the Ecuador embassy in London. He is the leader of WikiLeaks, which is a mass media, digital media journalism news service that has released a number of dossiers, collections of leaked data. WikiLeaks, right? They rely on getting leaked data from various government agencies around the world, quite often through hacking or through whistleblowers. And famously, the British state and the US administration don't quite like that. He, in particular, exposed the US military's attack on civilians, bombing with collateral damage of civilians of a suspect target in Iraq, and many other cases. And they released this footage to the chagrin of the dismay of the US Secret Services. Okay. He stayed in Ecuador embassy for a long time, taking refuge there because it looked like he was going to be extradited on what seemed like trumped up. Well, were trumped up charges of sexual assault, problematic. And so on, but it seems that the accusers were not the ones bringing the charge, and they've retracted any charge in any case. Anyway, he was going to be deported and feared being then deported to the US, where he'd be looking at 175 years in jail in a high max prison. So there's a big campaign not to extradite Assange, and a lot of discussion and debate. I'd be a bit surprised if you hadn't heard of him, but it's possible. So there's all sorts of like commentary and viewpoints that are somewhat contradictory, and all sorts of stories are told about him. His past is raked through his family background. His father was a member of a cult called The Family in Australia. Apparently they were also Seventh-day Adventists, and they were, see, why is that relevant to his political case? I don't know, but it does even affect me because I grew up near the Seventh-day Adventist campus in the hills, in the Dandenongs, where I grew up. And yeah, that just saying that, mentioning that group, makes anyone who lived near there, the crazies up the hill. Like, it's a character assassination thing. So the media has been full of these stories about Assange to distract from the basic fact of what he did, which was to release information about other people's crimes, not his own crime. He himself committed no violent crime, certainly not one that deserves him being locked up for nearly a decade now. Well, not free for nearly a decade. He's spent 2 years, as I said, in Belmarsh, high security prison in England, facing extradition to the US, where he'd be likely, even though they say he wouldn't, he'd be likely to be put in a Supermax prison. And anyway, yeah, he spent 7 years in the Ecuador embassy. Like, he had the run of the embassy for a long time because he was supported by the government, but change of governments made that more difficult. Change of Ecuadorian government. He had the run of the prison, the embassy rooms for a while. He was even running a RT, Russian newspaper channel, TV channel, a show, sometimes with Slavoj Žižek, the culture studies theorist, and many celebrities have gone to visit him there and so on. So he wasn't completely in like a jail in the embassy, but he couldn't leave the building. I mean, he would step out on the balcony and give speeches to the public. And he certainly couldn't leave Britain, because if he stepped outside the embassy, he would be arrested for breaking bail. Anyway, he lost the trust of the embassy staff in 2017, and they invited there's also some release of there's a story carried by WikiLeaks about corruption of the new Ecuadorian prime minister. Anyway, they invited the embassy invited the police into their embassy. Usually not a thing that can happen, but they did in this case, and Assange was arrested and carried out. There are pictures of him being carried out. It's pretty performative theatre of the British press. It's kind of crazy. Anyway, he got a 50-week tariff for that, for breaking bail, and he served that and much more now. He served more than double the time that he got for breaking bail, because there is this undisclosed, closed envelope accusation and extradition request from the US pending, and it's considered that he would be a flight risk. Well, yeah, he did. He went into the Ecuadorian embassy rather than submit to extradition before. So yeah, he might try something like that. So yeah, he stays in high security prison. They tried to stop him getting married, but he was already married. He was so free in the embassy. He was able to have 2 children with Stella Morris. She's a lawyer and campaigner. I met her once. She's very well informed. Anyway, they have 2 children, and they finally, after a bit of hassle, got married earlier this year. So Assange is facing 175 years for exposing US war crimes. And that's the crux of the debate. So should a journalist who was telling the truth, after all, I mean, there's documentary footage. Previously, I've shown that footage, and it's incontrovertible. Should he, whatever his character, religious background, or uncommitted crimes, should he be treated any differently than any other journalist? And doesn't it suggest that actually all journalists could be treated by the British and American state in this way? Assange himself, of course, has milked this because he wants to focus things on what's happening. He's being silenced by the US, he implies, with this image. right? The flag across as a gag. In the world of masks now that we're in, that's a kind of curious thing. That anyway, the idea is that the US. I've seen a similar one with the British flag across his mouth, and of course this is high symbolism. Student activists have used it. I remember when I was involved in student activism, climbing up statues to put a gag on the statues in Sydney because a student publication had been censored. So this is a whole censorship debate, freedom of speech and so on, which is central to the idea of journalism in so-called democracies. But the hypocrisy is that the so-called defenders of free speech and the free press are often the ones that have banned and repressed journalists much more than, or as much as at least, as some other places. That they make sorry about the drilling, that they make a lot of mileage on. So human rights abuses in China, journalists arrested in Vietnam, etc. And sure, all over the world there are cases, but the prominence of the case and yet the recalcitrance of the British state to do the right thing in this case, which is really obvious, is profound. So why is that profound? Well, because he is telling the truth, and we're talking about war here, war journalism, and massive secrets of the state. I don't know if you can hear the drilling, but it feels like it's drilling into my head right now. It seems like they're doing, it feels like the ceiling downstairs. I wonder if there's somewhere else I can go. The Wi-Fi isn't strong enough in my room. Maybe it's because I'm talking about Julian Assange. Conspiracy. Unfortunately, one of the things about Assange and that whole father in a cult thing, and Assange being a little bit of a strange character. He's got white hair, which apparently his hair went white during a custody battle with his first wife over their son Daniel. The trouble with it being WikiLeaks and digital is it's the world of digital espionage and conspiracy theories are given free rein here. Man, shall we go on a tour of my house and see if the Wi-Fi continues to work? Might drop out. Apologies for this. Okay. It's a little bit quieter in here. All right, sorry about that. So, yeah, more comfortable. Assange, yes. The problem with it being WikiLeaks and so digital, and he's got a background in the hacking, is that this is opened up or given a free space pretty much for for conspiracy theorists. Anyone with any idea about spies and about secrets of the state and double think and double agents and so on. I mean, Assange has. See, he was a part, when I worked at University of Technology in Sydney, he was a part of the so-called, it was never proven, but he was alleged to be a part of the hacking of NASA by some students in our university. As student union representatives, we defended. They didn't do any damage to NASA, but they showed that they were very good at hacking by getting in. This is the problem with hackers. They keep on saying, we could take down any system, and then they break into massive systems like NASA or something and don't do anything. They don't bring down the system. They show that they could. I kind of think, what's the point? But anyway, now that kind of espionage has become something that there are whole state departments doing it, no doubt. But yeah, he was caught getting into a medical intranet in Melbourne, and then he started working for the police for a while. So there's also conspiracy theories that are born of that. He worked on the other side of this police citizen line, and yeah, it's slightly problematic. Anyway, I just wanted to start with Assange to tell you about that story if you didn't already know about it. You can still find out more. There's updates and information on the web. And yeah, right now the court is considering the US extradition order. They've made a preliminary finding that they probably think it's unsafe for him to be deported, that the assurances the US given that he would be treated well can't be taken seriously. And so now they've got to an appeal stage where weirdly, he's not arguing on the fact that things were true. I told the truth. It's so he's arguing that he's got health issues and Asperger's syndrome and several other conditions that would make it unreasonable for him to be sent to a US prison. Like, it would be unhealthy. That, unfortunately, is possibly what will work in the British court, because they've got this kind of hypocritical, somewhat contradictory view. It's like justice isn't necessarily served, but if we can find a medical or an ethical, some kind of other reason that gets the same result, it's okay. So rather than actually say, no, the US are wrong, they'll say, oh no, but we're concerned about his health, his mental well-being and so on. And so therefore, even if he's guilty, we won't send him. But they're avoiding making a decision about the substantive nature of the case by finding, I think what will happen is, well, what might happen, actually it's the hope of the lawyers as well, they might find a way around it. Now, this contradiction is pretty standard for the UK, I'm afraid, because the question of justice just doesn't happen in so-called Western democracies. I mean, there's a structure of division of powers and courts, Supreme Court, and so on. But it seems like the arguments are always on technicalities rather than the substantive issue. And in fact, for real ethical justice anyway, you need to go outside the complete court system and get superheroes to intervene. I'm kind of making a joke, but I want to, and if you've been reading the text that was set, seems like the drilling stopped, by the way, I'll walk back. You'll know that the film Injustice is what I wanted to talk about today. But there are obviously two films called Injustice. One that came out in 2021, which is all about superpowers, superheroes and their superpowers. And of course, I think that's not insignificant because what do we say? The court systems have this fantasy supplement of the Dark Knight or Superman or so on that will fight for the American way of life and freedom, justice, and liberty, or whatever it is. That's the French, isn't it? But yeah, Injustice kind of steals the title of a 1999, well, a film made in 1999, but released in 2020, called Injustice by Ken Farrow, about police murder in Britain. Injustice was made, the original version of this film, not a version, the original film of this title. If you've been reading the article by Imogen Bunton, you'll know a lot more about this already. That's Imogen there. Show her properly. She is on my desk because she was a student of mine, and she dropped dead of a heart attack in New York in yeah, it's more than 10 years now. 10 years ago. She fell into a coma, and then after a couple of months had another massive heart issue and died. Anyway, she's written about it, so you've been reading her article this week. But I want to talk about Injustice, the film, not the sci-fi one, okay? Which tells the story of 10 really, but mainly 6 stories of black men or women. Joy Gardner is involved as well, who had died in police custody. And the question it asks, and it's an important one, and obviously for our discussion, it will be worth thinking about in terms of justice. Can the police commit murder? Is there such a thing even as a police crime? And who will prosecute the police if they commit crimes? And now in the UK, this system is broken and flawed, because since records started being collected, so 1969, of deaths in custody, as it's called, we have the same phrase in Australia, so on. It's disproportionately impacted on Aboriginal people. But in Britain, deaths in custody means you die after the police have arrested you. We're up to nearly 2,000 people since 1969 that have died in police custody, and not one policeman or police person has been prosecuted. There's been a couple of manslaughter inquiries just recently, but like by the time of this film, the number was more than 1,000, and no one at all had even been charged of a crime. 2 police, in the case of Brian Douglas, 2 police were suspended from duty for a period, but they got their jobs back. And there was a few other cases where police were put on desk duties. So this is a problem in the system of law, right? The question that's asked: police who kill, right? And in law, no matter what your crime, you really whatever you do on the streets in the city and so on, once the official forces pick you up, they have a duty of care to then put you into the legal system with a court case and a judge and investigations and all that to decide, all right? But you shouldn't receive further injuries or be beaten. There's no defense in law for the use of violence as punishment or even as restraint. So the question for Ken Farrow, the director of the film, the question to put to him is whether or not a film exposing these issues, think of Wikipedia and Julian Assange exposing the crimes of the US military, can a film exposing police crimes and state silence and collusion in these crimes do anything about the situation? Well, what does it do? So acknowledging that filmmaking and media have a great power, but also some limitations. So the story of this film in particular, as you'll have read from Imogen, has interesting effects. On the one side, the representation in the media by the police of the people they arrest is problematic. Joy Gardner was described as violent, but they taped her with 13 meters of 13 feet of tape around her face, of masking tape. They 13 feet, like more than just put on a gag. They over-determined that. They wrapped the tape around her head over and over and over, and she suffocated. And or others. Wayne Douglas was described as mentally ill. Another, Ibrahim Say, was described as like a huge man, a monster, and so it's too powerful, so the police had to restrain him and tied him and maced him and left him on the floor to suffocate. All of this, of course, in the context of Black Lives Matter, as we've talked about before in another class, right? But here, now the question is to talk about how a film of a crime or of police crimes might get into the mass public, if it can. And of course, you know from the article already, what happened was that it couldn't. It was banned. The film was effectively banned. It wasn't officially banned. That's the weird thing. In fact, Channel 4, who wanted to support such films, we even saw a memo. We have a memo from Channel 4 saying, if a film like Injustice comes across your desk, that's the sort of filmmaking we want to support. Although they were offered the film Injustice, and they've not been able to show it or refused to show it. And the very first screening of the film, it was to be at the Other Cinema in Soho, which is a small alternative hip cinema. There was going to be a screening, and in fact the families from United Friends and Families campaign, which is the families of the victims in this film, and they in a way were helping and involved in getting the story onto film. They were finally going to be able to go to a theatre, to a public event in a cinema, and see their story presented in a way that wasn't this police version of events, this version of events which is all about a mentally unstable man was arrested by the police and fought back and died, or a woman, Joy Gardner, was terribly violent and the police had to restrain her. I mean, to actually tell the content of the story, to show that those are just excuses on the part of the police. Brian Douglas, he was not hit in the head, he was hit in the shoulder, and yet he died of brain injuries, right? So to see the story for the first time finally put up in public and a cinema was some kind of event. It was important. They were all there, and so were the actually members of the Police Complaints Commission. They were there to see it because they necessarily have to seem to be impartial. I don't think at that stage there was an ombudsperson, but maybe if there was, they were there as well. So all the great and the good were there. It was a big event. But the Police Federation, which is effectively the yellow union for the police, the representative of the interests of the police, brought out an injunction against, well, not against the film, because the filmmakers would have welcomed that. Okay, yeah. Why don't you bring out a court order against the film? Then we can go to court and debate this, whether it's not true or not. And finally, some police will be facing the court. No, instead, the Police Federation came out with a court injunction against the owner of the cinema, saying, if you show this film, we will sue you. And we will tie you up in the courts for months and months, and you'll need lawyers and you'll need all these expenditures and so on. And the owner of the film, of the theatre, who was, it turns out, a migrant Cuban woman, divorcee, who like invested all her money and all of her time and everything in running this dream project of a cinema, couldn't really risk being caught up for months and months in a court case with the police historically, no one ever wins because of the system. So they had to pull the film. And this, of course, caused a ruckus, chaos, another protest. And of course, it was an opportunity for people to protest because it got the story out in front of the media again, or an attempt to, although it didn't. The story became the power of the police federation the police shouldn't have to put up with people making unfounded accusations, etc., etc. Now, were there unfounded accusations in the film? The police are described as murderers, and there has not been a court that has said that they murdered. The court found them guilty of negligence and ordered additional training in the case of Brian Douglas, of Duffy, and the two cops that had killed Brian Douglas were ordered to have additional training in the use of the new long police truncheon. So police in England, I don't know if you know, they're not generally don't carry guns. They carry truncheons, although some special police units, SPG, do carry guns, and of course they're famous for shooting a Brazilian man in the head 11 times in 2005 because they thought he was an Asian terrorist. Brazilian, Asian, they all look the same. That kind of thinking. 11 times in the head? Why do you need to shoot someone 11 times? Well, even one would be bad. I don't. Just that little detail of 11 times is crazy. Anyway, yeah, normally the police don't carry guns, but they have these extra long new truncheons that were issued apparently to the two cops that killed Brian Douglas, and they were ordered to have additional training. Anyway, the film was not shown at the initial screening, so the premiere was disrupted by the Police Federation, and no other cinema then. The Migrant Media, Ken Farrow and Migrant Media, the makers of the film, then approached the Hoyt Cinema Network, I think it was, and similarly, the Police Federation threatened to sue the cinema chain. And they, of course, made a boardroom decision that was understandably, perhaps, not in favor of taking on the police. But Ken Farrow and Migrant Media, of course, and the Families and Friends campaign wanted to take on the police in court. They want to get these things into a court and have the issues of justice and deaths in custody debated, because it needs to happen. Anyway, they wanted to have the film seen as well. So they went to extraordinary efforts to get the film done. So some of my students worked on the film, doing subtitles and intertitles and the credits and things like that. Working in not the actual filming, but the making, putting together of the film. And so we would organize. Can you turn that off, please? Theodore? Sorry, it's my son's class. He keeps on wanting to do it in this room. He's got the Wi-Fi at the other end of the house. We organized screenings by, I wonder if I can draw this. I don't know whether I can draw on this. This is my son's pictures. He sees his future as why do I have to go to school when I can draw and he's going to become a YouTuber? Anyway, maybe not. So you imagine that there's an area of London, and in the streets of London there might be an area where there are 4 tube stations. Right? Near a venue which was a community centre that no one knew about as going to be the site for the screening of the film. And people were from migrant media or our students were stationed at each of the tube stations, the railway stations, with a little sign or something like that. And people knew, they got from advertising or from phone calls, they knew who to look for, what colour shirt or something, and they met up with the individuals at the tube stations and then walked to the undisclosed location, which was a community centre, Caribbean Centre, or some other community centre, which was prepared to show the film and risk the arrival of the Police Federation. Although because it was kept secret, the Police Federation didn't have time to go and get an injunction to stop the screening. So screenings could go ahead even if the Police Federation later tried to come down against it. So the community was taking risks because they wanted to see the film. But it was very strange to be part of this kind of community of resistance and linking up individuals and people who wanted to go to see the film from tube stations and marching them through parts of London to go to this covert screening, all very exciting and kind of fun. All right, but yeah. Otherwise, the film would have died. It was not being shown on Channel 4, not being shown in any other television press. It was not being shown in any mainstream cinemas. And so for anyone to see the film, there had to be something. We did screen it on Channel 4 in that, in a way, we set up on the anniversary of one of the deaths in custody, we set up a projector outside the offices of Channel 4 and screened it onto the building. So it has been shown on Channel 4 TV station, but not actually on the broadcast, just on the side of the building. So we can say it's been shown on Channel 4. Drilling has begun again. This is not a happy experience, is it? So I'll get up to this end again. Sorry about this. So yeah, it was difficult for the media to deal with it, even if they were supportive, and generally they wouldn't. The mainstream distribution circuit wasn't operative, and that was a factor. Now, of course, the migrant media and friends and friends and family and friends campaign, they were tireless in their efforts to support the film, and of course they were, because it was in their interest to get their story out, and a film is a great vehicle for it's an organizing tool. A film can be a focus for events, for getting people to spread the word, but also getting people together to talk about what to do next, and so on. And it was invaluable in that they were ready to come and talk, but also it was in their interest. That's why they did it, especially to come to when we started to show the film at universities, because it turned out that the Police Federation wouldn't stop screenings at universities, because the universities then, which were a bit more progressive, would resist being taken to court by the police. They say, yeah, get on, and things would disappear. So these so-called guerrilla screenings were going on, and there was a lot of support for seeing film. But to this day, that film, 10 years on now, has never been seen on British television, even though it's won awards all over the world. It's been screened in nearly over 100 countries. It's been claimed by the Black Lives Matter movement as this great film, and so on. lost my screen. Now, there's a sense in which the film also tries to elaborate the idea of a wider social movement against state violence and police terror by providing information, by telling the truth, telling the story from a non-police perspective to counter the version that's in the dominant media. Like the subtle ways in which that story in the media, the stories in the media are interpretation is political. The subtle way in which the stories are, well, the question is, can you see that interpretation is always political? So a story can be either police cars, of course, like all cars, cause some accidents, or rather the police are equipped with special killing machines. They don't have to obey the road rules in the same way. They speed around we're talking about police cars in the UK, right? It's a completely different environment here. Your experience here is you simply hardly see the police in the street. I mean, occasionally they're at a street corner, maybe waiting for some white guy on a motorcycle to get stopped so they can get some coffee money. Did I say that out loud? Sorry, no, that was just my thought process. Maybe that's what they're doing, I don't know. But the visibility of the police in the US and the UK is very, very different. And this is a part of the propaganda story as well, right? So groups like Migrant Media, but also Cop Watch USA, Cop Watch Australia, Deaths in Custody, Royal Commission demands, Smash Federation, prisoner support, and in other countries as well, like anti-ISA campaign in Malaysia in the 2000s, want to make people see, raise the question at least for people to see, is there a different story about what's happening with the privileged use of force, power and violence in the interests of the so-called law to maintain a elite grip on power. And it is an elite that is supported by this kind of imbalance of attacks on people of color, Black lives, or the just different, Brazilian, or in the white supremacists. I say that thinking, right, that sounds like old language from the 70s, but it really still exists. That the underlying assumptions in the UK and in Europe generally are increasingly perhaps with the rise of some of the right-wing groups, mapping things onto a very entrenched, difficult to budge sense of superiority of white people in culture that devalues anyone who's not white supremacy ideology. And it's in the institutions. It's in the institutions, and it's assumed that that's okay, that these institutions that are predominantly white. There are very few black police, of course. There are some, of course there are. But even they, quite often, the disproportionate number of black police, black ex-police who left the police because of taunting, harassment, racism within the force is phenomenal. Now, what we need to see happening is actually what we need to discuss or question ourselves, perhaps, is how does this relate to wider questions about, I don't know, what we do in sociology, which is to kind of map social realities and organization. So I want to make a kind of a bit of a switch today to talk about how we understand basic sociological characters with this media injustice in mind. And the new film, which is called Ultraviolence, I should mention, just come out, winning lots of awards and actually getting seen at cinemas. So there is also a bit of a change. Partly because I think, the mapping of social reality as recognizing racism has been affected by these films like this, or media support for Black Lives Matter and things like that. Or I'd say also the way in which new media forms, like everyone having a camera in their pocket, a video camera in their pocket, have meant that we see this ultra-violence more often. So there have been films, more and more films of little handheld citizen films, if you like, of incidents of police aggression. They're called to account more often now because people carry cameras. Now, of course, in famous cases like the Rodney King beating, where that was filmed by someone with a Sony camera in a flat above, and the beating was down on the street below, we all over the world, everyone saw the Rodney King beating and saw 7 cops beating a black man who was on the ground. But the digital can be used by lawyers. Of course, once you get to court, you have to contend with lawyers. They slowed down every frame where Rodney King was hit by a truncheon by those police. And they were able to show that in each instance, Rodney King had moved somehow, and they said that that was him resisting arrest. And that got the police off. Even if he went like that, like he was resisting arrest. And they broke the film down digitally. They were able to use the technology that is also making more and more film available, but they're also able to use it to put forward an interpretation that if you watch the film in real time, your interpretation can't be anything but those police are beating a black man who's lying on the ground. But if you break it up digitally and go frame by frame, and a good lawyer is in your corner, as the lawyers were in the corner of these police, you can spin the interpretation in a completely different way. And then it becomes a matter of who's got the better rhetoric, the better spiel, the better talk to spin the truth in the direction of a certain position. Anyway, okay, so I wanted to talk, of course, about Marx, but Marx, in the chapter we were looking at about white skin, black skin recently. In chapter 8, or chapter 10 in English, Marx quotes a bit of Latin from Horace, mutato nomine de te fabula narrator. All right, my Latin accent is probably as bad as my Vietnamese, right? But the English, this means mutato, change, nomine, names, de te fabula, fantasy, narrator, person telling the story or story. So an English version of that sentence would be, the names are changed, but this story is told about you. And in a way, that's why I talked about Assange and then about black deaths in custody, police violence, because in a way it's also the construction of the black, and the other is also the construction of the workers, as shown in Marx's chapter in Capital, on the working day. So I just want to go through a little bit of that, because why it's helpful for us in understanding the media is the importance of metaphor. Now, I've talked about metaphor in other classes as well, but metaphor and allegory, I can't emphasize how much all sociology relies on metaphors and allegories, stories that are told of one thing, but they only really work if you can think somehow they actually mean to spin an interpretation about something else. What is a metaphor? So in sociology, we use especially metaphors of the landscape. Right, so we stare out at the social landscape, and we see it as a picture, and we try and represent it. And we use different tools to do that. We make representations through, I don't know, questionnaires or ethnographic description, anthropologists, or interviews, but they're really trying to map a kind of social. Now, a map of the landscape or a picture of the landscape. That's a metaphor and an allegory. And we accept it as pretty normal, it's pretty true. That society and social relations can be pictured, right? Or stories can be told about them. And I think there's no getting around that. That's how we communicate. But we also need to see that, step back and say, so we're telling stories about the social relations. That's a certain kind of rhetorical structure, right? So the social maps that we make about social relations and class relations or race relations requires us to reduce the massive complexity of the world into a certain number of things that we can describe and picture. And it's necessarily reductive, that's what I'm saying. We have to do that, and not even a bad thing. In order to communicate, we need to exclude a whole lot of things so that we can even just say something. You know, if we didn't do that, right? If your attention didn't focus and exclude the majority of what you could sense at the moment, just the world couldn't make sense, couldn't cohere, it would be chaos. I mean, you've got so much input happening at any one time. If you don't be very, very selective, you won't be able to then regurgitate it as a story or as a meaningful phrase. How to explain this, right? Right now, you choose among which of the senses you're going to pay attention to. Hopefully, you're listening, and maybe you're reading and watching, but you're ignoring, I don't know, sounds outside. That drill. All right, it stopped again, so maybe I can go back to my desk because it's not very. You ignore, I don't know. Now that I start to mention it, we're going to face. It's going to raise other sensations. For example, I don't know, where you're sitting right now, what are your feet touching? You've got sensory input coming into your feet right now. I'm putting my feet on the floor and I'm now sensitized to them, and I'll tell you a story about that. I feel the wood and I feel the part of the table underneath, right? And generally, in order to give a lecture or to focus on a story and so on, I would be excluding that. I'm excluding how I feel about the fan on me. I'm excluding incidental sounds outside. I'm excluding, I don't know, any thought about what I have to do later or what other things are stressing me, the mild migraine that I feel like I'm getting, and so on and so forth, in order to focus on what I'm doing now. And in sociology, we do that as well. In order to tell a story about, I don't know, families, we have to then exclude many other things that potentially could impact, and we include them to the extent that they could impact on our story. But you have to exclude, to tell a story about the family, you have to ignore a whole lot of other things, the nation or the environment, or except to the extent that they're relevant. We're always doing that. We're always selecting. In order to say something about something, you have to ignore all the other things. That's the nature of our conventions. It's indexicality. That's what allows us to read, because we then have a system of representation that will locate certain words and certain stories about things that we can convey to another person and they'll get it. And that's where interpretation enters in. In that reduction, then our meaning making is a contest over those representations. And the winner in the contest is the person who can get their interpretation of the world accepted more than somebody else, right? And if you have resources to do that, own the media or have a police federation organization or something, or you can try and have some other resources by building community and forming a family and friends organization or a political party, or talk about the proletariat, the working class. You have a chance of getting your story told and your interpretation put into the mix, so to speak. And so all storytelling, all interpretation, and all science uses a mapping kind of metaphor and an allegoric metaphoric code. It's absolutely. And Marx, of course, does this. And in fact, he was a master of it. The way in which he was able to map and tell the story of the working class is all powerful. So really powerful. So it's worth examining how he does so. Look at the storytelling that he manages in his scientific analysis of the working class. And doing science is storytelling. Because he writes chapter 8 in German, chapter 10 in English of Capital, in a way that really is impressive. He writes it almost last of all the chapters in Das Kapital in volume 1, and he does so in a way that he'd always planned, I think, because it follows, the core idea of the book. It's in fact the hinge in which the two parts of the book, if you like, the first part about key concepts, surplus value, exchange value, use value, are set out, and the second half, how those concepts make sense in terms of cooperation, machinery, imperialism, and so on. Right? So chapter 8 is really crucial, and chapter 8 is sort of a rewriting, in a way, of his friend Engels, not a big enough word, book from 1844, The Condition of the Working Class in England. And in fact, Marx says that he won't rewrite that book. He won't rewrite the period before 1844 because it's already been done so well by Friedrich Engels. He wants to write the next 20 years, that story. But it's a big chapter, and how could we read it, right? I decided not to set it as reading for you, but if you're really keen, you could go and read it. It's a good way to start Capital if you haven't read the other chapters, and it's a good revision chapter if you have read them. But it's a huge chapter, and but it's about the condition of workers, right? And the idea of mutato nomine data fabula, right? Whatever let's go back, sorry. Mutato nomine data fabula narrator. The idea of the story is told of you, with the names are changed, but this story is really about you, is that Marx was writing this story about the English working class in German for the German working class, saying, this is going to happen to you guys too. You're next in the developing process of capitalism. Right? And interestingly, I think that's why the story of Capital was picked up as well by the French, then the Russians, or the Russians, then the French, and then so many other countries, on and on and on, and it's still today. Why it's still relevant. Here comes the drilling again. Anyway, all right, what's the story of the working day? It starts off the working day, talks about the limits of the working day, and he's talking about labor power, and he's trying to work out how value is produced for the capitalist. The capitalist gets a worker to work A to C, but the part of reproducing all the materials of production and the worker, this is stuff you'll know, is A to B, and B to C is the part of the day that is the worker still working, but their pay has already been covered, the cost of material have already been covered, the expenses of production have already been covered. The work that they do in those last B to C period, however long it is, will be profit. And it's in the interests of the capitalist to either reduce the length of the day that is spent on reproducing the cost of production so that B to C is a bigger proportion of the day, or to increase the length of the day so the capitalist is getting more profit because the workers are working for longer, or there are more workers. And it's basic algebra that's being set out in the start of this chapter that makes sense. That's one part of the storytelling, and that's a more technical and scientific part, right? I'm not going to go into the translation issues, but here it is as well, that in Tingviet, right? Nei lao dong, not nei lao dong. Hi, and it's covered up, nei lao dong, ba, right? But the idea is A to B is the reproduction of the worker, the workplace, wages, all of the costs, and B to C is going to be surplus value, which then has to be put into the making of new commodities, which has to be put into circulation and recouped through sales as profit. And that might not happen. You can end up with overproduction and a glut, or there might be some circulation problems, all sorts of other parts of the story. But this is the key secret for value production, as you know. Right? And now the whole working day, though, is not that formula. Right? That's what's been established up to now in the chapter. And now this chapter is going to be this kind of retelling of the story that sets it up for the rest of the chapter. And in fact, to make the book really make sense. It makes the story, the interpretation, it clinches the interpretation. It's like finally Marx is the one able to put the film of the injustice of capitalists extracting value, the real truth of that story, up on screen for us to see. Right? And the screen is the chapter. Right? In the same way, before that, we had Adam Smith or the other economists, those sycophants and operatives for capital, basically behaving like the police federation and saying, actually the workers they're terribly lazy, and if the capitalist wasn't there to organize them and do the work, there would be no profit, right? Or that the last hour that they work, they have to work this extra hour because that's where the profit is. All those versions of political economy up until Marx did not get at the truth. Marx is able to show that value is created by this production of surplus value. By paying the workers, that's the secret, the big breakthrough, less than they produce in a day. So the cost of paying the worker is A to B and all of the costs of production, but the worker works a whole day and the capitalist owns all of that, so that the capitalist gets for free, not having to pay the worker for the extra time, the extra value produced. Right? Now, but how does he tell the story? The working day formula is a little bit abstract and difficult to grasp unless you have, they're very abstract points. Marx becomes a storyteller. He starts by going through all the difficult conditions of 19th century labor, especially for women and children. And this is really an ethnographic chapter. There's lots of sociological description that he's got out of studying the blue books, the reports of factory inspectors that I'll talk about. I'm going to talk about. But also, he relies on storytelling from literature as well. He quotes Charles Dickens. He is a fan of Charles Dickens, right? He means Oliver Twist and Hard Times and Bleak House. He's a fan of Thackeray, of Elizabeth Bronte and Gaskell, right? They also tell the story of the condition of the working class in the 19th century. And they do it in very sentimental terms, and so in a way does Marx, and why he likes these. He calls it the splendid brotherhood of fiction writers in England. Of course, some of them were women, Bronte, Gaskell, but anyway, a brotherhood. Whose graphic and eloquent pages have issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. Right? He's in the debate about interpretation. They have described every section of the middle class, from the highly genteel, annuitant, and fund holder who looks upon all sorts of business as vulgar, to the little shopkeeper and lawyer's clerk. And how have Dickens and Thackeray and Miss Bronte and Miss Gaskell painted them? Are full of presumption, affectation, petty tyranny, and ignorance, right? Whole and real. And the civilizing world have confirmed their verdict with the damning epigram that is fixed to this class. They are servile to those above and tyrannical to those beneath them. Yeah, so the descriptions of the different classes by Dickens and Thackeray and so on, and Disraeli, for example, in his novels, Tancred, 1830, and so on, are full of heady squabbles and difference and detail, gritty detail. But they also include this stereotype that the working class are poor and well-meaning, but a bit stupid, really, or lazy, right? And think of Dickens' Christmas Carol. It's nearly Christmas, right? So we're reading this with the kids. The Scrooge, who's this terrible capitalist, has finally a road to Damascus conversion because he finds that little Tiny Tim, who's so, and Fat Cratchit, Bob Cratchit, they've worked. They're so unusual. They're not like what you really think the working class were like. They're not lazy and vagabonds. They're actually really human. And he finds out. And in fact, many of Dickens' stories are like that, finding out that actually the working class are not fitting the stereotype. Think of what happens to in Hard Times, where the factory owner finds that Sissy, the basically daughter of a circus performer, turns out to be more cultured, more refined, and more human than he ever could be, despite all of his learning and study of the blue books, the same books that Marx is reading. What were the blue books? Now, there are two kinds of literary reference in the map of this chapter, Capital, that Marx relies on. One is all the literature, right? Dickens, Horace, Shakespeare, Dante, Homer, Schiller, so many. But the other is the factory inspectors. And the factory inspectors were these, for various reasons, the British government instituted the process of having an inspector of factories go to the factories and make a report on how the factories were doing on various social standards, right? It was like the government wanted to have a regulatory system in place, and they set up a series of what were called blue books. They were studies that were published by on health or on education, or on factories or on the young, and set up commissions to prepare these books, sociological studies of the condition of the working class, right? Unlike Engels' condition of the working class, though, these were done by the government. France didn't do this. Germany didn't do this. The English kind of, it's really amazing that they did it, and also slightly problematic. Leonard Horner, who was the chief factory inspector, is the one that's identified in this chapter as most important. He is the chief inspector of factories. He also turns out to have been the vice chancellor of the University of London. So definitely establishment. right? And his brother was in the Royal Society, and so on and so forth. And there's a picture of him. Yeah. Marx notes that Leonard Horner does a service for the working class, and his story should never be forgotten. It kind of is forgotten, but that's by the by. The blue books, though, themselves, historical volumes published by the government, they still exist, in fact. Dickens mentions them in Hard Times. The main character, Gradgrind, who's changed by Sissy, is learned because he has a shelf of blue books. Facts, he says, facts. And these books are full of facts, but of course they're interpretations, but that's by the by. And Hard Times is about him learning to be more human. But these books exist, the blue books, they still exist, and they report on nearly everything. The government reports are often, they're called blue books because they're in blue covers, although I have traced that this goes back to a thing in India and the production of indigo, a kind of dye, the dye that's in your blue jeans, right? If you've got any blue jeans, then you've got clothing that's originally was dyed with indigo, and that is some kind of affinity with the mode of production of this process, paper as well. The same product goes into producing the blue books. Here are some reports I just pulled up on Google Books of annual report of inspectors of the factory. I mean, these are in New York as well. America does it not always as blue. They do yellow ones. Women in the factory, industrial commission, health, labor relations, in workshop, factory inspectors report, Department of Labor, and so on. All of these books as well then are collected into the British Library where Marx is reading. And he reproduces, if you look in Capital, he reproduces huge quote after quote from these books. In fact, they substitute for his first-hand research. And in fact, it's Horner that goes and does the first-hand research. Leonard Horner is off as a guest of various factory owners, and it's not just the blue books he uses, of course. He is able to interpret the blue books facts with alternative or other information that he gets from other stories. For example, from newspapers from all over the world, Bengal, Harikuru, Friend of India, so on, and the discussions of the International Working Men's Association, which is happening at the same time, reports and journalism and so on, but also first-hand experience from Engels, and more importantly, Engels's partners. Let's look at Engels' 1844 book, The Condition of the Working Class, that Marx says is the basis for his thinking for the Working Day chapter. What you see in the picture here is Mary Burns. It was Engels' first partner a long time. Mary Burns was an Irish worker who basically introduced Engels, who after all was aristocracy. He was there because his father said, stop hanging around with that Marx guy, you've got to go and work for the family firm. He was there for Urban and Engels. Urban and Engels was a factory, they owned a number of factories, and they were based of cotton manufacture, based in Manchester, for part of the company based in Manchester. And Engels was sent there to look after to work in the family firm. Interestingly, he was offered a choice by his father. You either go to New York, Manchester, or Calcutta, because Calcutta was up and coming. Because Marx was friends with Engels and knew that Engels had access to information that Marx did not, Marx would probably have followed him. He followed him to England, after all. He probably would have followed him to New York, or even to Calcutta. What would the history of communism look like if Marx had gone to Calcutta and been exposed really much more closely to colonialism than he was already sensitized to it, and especially because he was interested in weavers because of where he grew up in Trier in Germany. The Silesian weavers were not far away. Anyway, Mary Burns was an Irish worker, and Engels, I know, one day he was walking through the factory and their eyes met across the cotton machine or whatever, and it was love. But it was also a lot of fun because she was apparently hard drinking and part of a fun family of singing and going out to sit in these dens, bars that Engels liked to go along drinking with them. And she introduced him to other Irish workers, and he got an insight into the working of the firm, and Engels, and the other conditions of the working class, small, terrible housing in Manchester. I've lived in it. I know how small they can be. Engels got access to information he would never have even known about otherwise through Mary Burns and her sister Lizzie Burns, who Engels took up with after Mary Burns died in 1863. And eventually Engels marries Lizzie Burns on her deathbed in 1878. I mean, Engels was not into conventional relationship in the same way. Maybe neither were these two women, clearly. And unfortunately, Mary dies 40 years of age. Difficult conditions for Irish workers in Manchester. Lizzie is the younger, but she lives a lot longer. Still, Engels lives on long after she passes away. So there was some kind of like, Marx was not very sympathetic when she died, and in fact Jenny Marx was a little bit rude to Lizzie. Anyway, that kind of biographical detail hardly matters. What does matter though is that they provided Engels, and then through Engels, Marx, access to stories or interpretations of the proletariat, the working class, that they would not have got. So mixed with the blue books. I mean, comparing the stories that he gets from Lizzie Burns to the blue books, Engels dismisses them as waste paper from the commissions of inquiry. His book was research with Mary Burns and Lizzie, you know, well, let's read together Engels' own introduction and explanation of why. Right? Now, in the introduction to the 1844 book that Marx says he can't improve on, right? Engels writes, I have studied the various official and non-official documents as far as I could get hold of them. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Mary. I've not been satisfied with this, and I wanted more than a mere abstract knowledge of my subject. Right? I wanted to see you, he's writing to the workers, right? I wanted to see you in your own homes, to observe you in your everyday life, to chat with you on your conditions and grievances, to witness your struggles against the social and political power of your oppressors. I have done so. Right? So without the two women, he would not have got access, but he has to. I forsook the company and the dinner parties, the port wine and champagne of the middle classes. Gave up champagne and devoted his leisure hours almost exclusively to the intercourse with plain working men and women. And I'm both glad and proud of having done so. Glad because thus I was induced to spend many a happy hour in obtaining knowledge of the realities of life, many an hour which else would have been wasted in fashionable talk and tiresome etiquette. Having at the same time ample opportunity to watch the middle classes, your opponents, I soon came to the conclusion that you are right, perfectly right, and expecting no support from them whatsoever. Their interest is diametrically opposed to yours. though they always will try and maintain the contrary and make you believe that their most hearty sympathy is with your fate. Their doings give them the lie. Be their words what they please, the middle classes intend in reality nothing else but to enrich themselves by your labour while they can sell its produce, and to abandon you to starvation as soon as they cannot make a profit by this indirect trade in human flesh. What have they done to prove the professed goodwill towards you? Have they ever paid any serious attention to your grievances? Have they done more than paying the expenses of half a dozen commissions of inquiry, whose voluminous reports are damned to everlasting slumber among heaps of waste paper on the shelves of the Home Office? Have they even done as much as to compile from those rotting blue books a single readable book from which everybody might easily get some information on the condition of the great majority of free-born Britons? Not they, indeed. Those are things they do not like to speak of. They have left it to a foreigner to inform the civilized world of the degrading situation you have to live in. Engels is that foreigner. And then Marx is the one who writes up this chapter in chapter 8 of The Working Day. How does he write it? I mean, what do we make of the Gothic horror, right? I talked about elsewhere vampires and werewolves and Pharisees and also stories about the Crimean War and the Light Brigade, the sacrifice of children under the wheels of the juggernauts, the chariot of the god Juggernaut. Marx spares no, like he drags in every allegory of storm, the tempest from Shakespeare, and drama to really retell and to reanimate this story that, as Engels points out, the middle classes would rather not speak of. So when we read this chapter and then also recognize that where Marx quotes the middle class and the professors, Macaulay is also quite fun when he dismisses them as sycophants and fine talkers. These dark tones of the chapter need to be understood or annotated. How do we annotate them? Well, the people have been doing this for a long time. This chapter gets discussed more than any, perhaps, except for the first. Right here, I'll just show you quickly one map. Somebody has rewritten Capital with reference to all of its geographical locations. Maybe I'll put the link up for this in the on the e-learning. You can drill down using this map on the electronic file, not on this slide in the PDF on the PowerPoint. You can drill down and read different paragraphs from the chapter of Capital now on a map. And each of these lines, for example, these lines going under Africa, one of them goes into, so this yellow one goes into Vietnam, are where Marx talks about, well, Indochina he talks about actual locations. Now, that's one way of retelling the story, right? But Marx's retelling the story is super interesting. I mentioned he has that bit about labor in the white skin, the black branded. So he's talking about the context of the Civil War. But there's also other parts where the allegorical storytelling, interpretive spin is strong. He calls the capitalist, not the capitalist, but money bags. Because what is the capitalist? Not a person. The capitalist likes to think that they work really hard, but Marx is pointing out that they didn't earn their money. They just got bags they inherited their wealth. Think of, he's thinking of really not just bosses of enterprise, right? He's talking about the really big bosses, the people like today we would call Elon Musk or Bezos or that guy who owns Facebook. What's his name? Something Berg. I always forget. Jutterberg, Fickerberg, Moggerberg, whatever his name is. They are rich through investment and capital and trade in fictional money. They didn't earn their money. And you know, of course, that to be as wealthy as Elon Musk or someone like that, you will need to earn something like, somebody worked it out as you need to have earned $10,000 per day since the Stone Age to actually be as big a billionaire as. So there's no relation between the working day and the wealth of these capitalists. Money bags is what they call them. And then similarly, in the representation of the architecture of the chapter, it's really interesting because he uses representative voices. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, we finally hear, and remember this is chapter 8, so for the first time in the book, it's all been about concepts and so, and maybe a few voices from political science, but it's been about concepts. For the first time, we actually hear from the voice of a worker, and it's a quotation from the Brickmakers Society or the Bakers Society. The worker says in their voice, they talk about the hours of work they work. Right? It's the first time that you read a quote of a worker. Now, it's an amalgamated worker. It's a representation of a worker. And it's a single worker, though. They're saying, I work for you, and you pay me a certain amount, but of course, then you take the value of the day of my work. So you don't pay me the true value of my work. And I know this. So Marx is kind of setting out his analysis in the voice of a single worker. Interestingly, then we go through the chapter, and it's the struggles of workers to first of all, get paid adequately, but also to only have to work a certain number of hours, not 16 a day, but 10 a day. So the struggle for hours. So the chapter really is drawing all the detail out of the blue books in order to tell the history of the struggles to reduce the number of hours that workers will work. And then by the end of the chapter, so there's this overall story. The individual worker has started to complain about the situation, and then it's the story of the various campaigns of workers putting their efforts into organizing, and the factory inspectors and all of that process of organizing to have a legislation that will compel the ruling class, Elon Musk and those people, the versions of that from moneybags in the 19th century, to not overuse the workers, and it's because the workers got together as a class. And Marx says they've zusammenrotten, they've smashed their heads together and formed an organization that can pressure the ruling class into legislating reduction of the workday and a restriction. The workday must be 10 hours, later it's 8 hours, right? They put a legal limit on the working day, what he calls a modest magna carta, a statement of principle that which becomes, 8 hours sleep, 8 hours play, 8 hours work. Although, of course, the capitalist wants to see it 8 hours work plus overtime, and then play, you consume the products, and then sleep. We'll even try and monetize your sleep now, by the by. What I'm saying is the story of the chapter is this architecture of the story from individual voice of the worker to getting organized and collective, the collective voice of the worker. They bang their heads together like a gang, zusammenrotten, and they compel the ruling class to accept this legislation that, Leonard Horner had suggested, and then there was this slow process, right? But it's the factory inspectors that are a step on the way of organising the working class as a body. Of course, you know, the working day now has been decimated by digital technology, so we can work everywhere and anywhere all the time. There's a need to put our heads together again and compel some way of getting recognised for the labour that everyone is doing. The drilling stopped again. I'm going to take this opportunity to stop as well, and maybe get some headache medicine, Dao, from the drilling. It's crazy. Sorry about it, all that. We'll go to the discussion now. On the e-learning, I put questions that will start our discussion. So I get you to spend some time on that, and then we'll chat. So we'll have a conversation about that and about the